Okay, so you ready to take a test? You guys all love taking tests, right? It's funny, I talked to someone who tries to keep their license up, and they said, I don't really worry about getting my credits. I just go take the test every 2 years. How many of you would like to do that? I was glad when I got out of college I didn't have to take them so much anymore. So, but this is easy. And the fact that you don't have to pass your paper to your neighbor to have him grade it so they can see how smart you are. You can just answer this yourself. We're not going to write this down or anything, but I thought just think to yourself. We'll answer the question, and we'll talk just a little about these diseases and why it's important to make sure you have the right diagnosis. So if we start off, we go here, can you think of what is this disease right here? You've got potato seed pieces, they've got some fungus growing on them, and if you were to cut these surfaces, this is what you see. Is it pythium leak, soft rot, dry rot, or pink rot? You got your answer in mind? This one might have been an easy one. It's Fusarium dry rot. There's actually several different species that can cause dry rot. This is some work that was done by Christy Christian, who was a graduate student at the University of Idaho, working with Kasha Duhlman. And they would take potatoes, and these are all russet Burbank, they would infect them with different Fusarium species. And they caused a range of symptoms over here. Now this is Fusarium ceruleum, and it is a much more aggressive seed decay organism. In fact, these were all incubated the same level of time. Those are the black background. This is different. And so it's not necessarily that you get this much disease in the same amount of time as you're getting these over here, but it is a much more devastating disease. And interestingly enough, we don't see that very often anymore. When we used to see Fusarium ceruleum, we would have significant issues with stand. And so you'd have a very spotty stand in the field. There'd be a lot of seed decay. Most of what we see now, at least most of what Christy found in her evaluations, were in southern Idaho, were Fusarium sambucinum. And it is a little bit more of a slower decay organism, so it doesn't tend to wipe out the potatoes as fast. However, Fusarium sambucinum is much more of a problem in potato storages. So when we have tubers in storage, we start to see dry rot. More often than not, it tends to be Fusarium sambucinum. And the way we manage this is it does help to have clean seed. There is some work that would show the amount of seed that has Fusarium is going to be somewhat of an indicator of your risk come harvest time. Also make sure that your knives are sharp. Research shows that dull knives tend to make a cut that won't heal as fast as if the knives are sharper. And then you can use different seed treatments. And towards the end of the day here, we're going to talk about some research where we looked at different seed treatments and how they did against some of these organisms. A few things about Fusarium. We have seen symptoms where you get this infection that occurs just in the vascular system. This is a little bit unusual. We don't see this very often. Sometimes the Fusarium is followed by Bacterial Soft Rot. And in that case, the infected potato just is mush, and it will come right away, just peel right off. And this is what it looks like in Clearwater russet. Clearwater happens to be one of the more susceptible varieties that we have to Fusarium dry rot. So we do tend to see it more there than in some other varieties. Ranger and Umatilla are also highly susceptible. And other varieties other than that tend to be a little bit more resistant on a relative scale. So let's jump to this one. Have any of you seen this before? This with a seed piece, it looks kind of like a tannish gray. It's quite slimy. I mean, this just peels away. Is this more Fusarium dry rot, Bacterial Soft Rot, Pythium leak, or toxic seed piece syndrome? Got your answer? This is toxic seed piece syndrome. How many of you have heard of this before? Nobody? Or you're just not raising your hand? Ray, you have? This is something that showed up in the Columbia Basin about probably 15, 20 years ago. And there was all kind of efforts made to see, is there something that's actually infecting this potato causing to do this? And actually, for all the work that they did, they could never find a living agent that was causing this to happen. It was almost like it was a physiological breakdown. And to this day, we still don't even know what it is. Now, there are some pictures out there that show fields that have really, really poor stands, and it seems to be related to this. However, it's pretty rare. I will say that we do see this from time to time in our research trials, and we've looked to see if different seed treatments will have an effect on this, and they do not seem to affect it. It just seems to be somewhat random. But if you see this, know that that's what it is. Toxic seed piece syndrome. There are 2 bulletins that are out there. If you go search on this on the internet, you're going to find one that was written by Michigan State University. They have one called Toxic Seed Piece Syndrome, and then there's one at Washington State University put together. And both of those will give you pictures, at least to help you see what it is, but they both say that there really is no management that we know of for this at this time. So, the next one, what is this disease right here? You look and you've got necrotic or dead tissue starting to peel away. In this case, the top of the plant is melted down. Is that late blight, gray mold, fertilizer burn, or early blight? Got your choice made. And this is actually some potato late blight is the right answer. And fortunately, we don't see this very often, but I wanted to put this up as an encouragement to go out and scout. Now, right now, James Woodall at the University of Idaho operates a spore trapping network, and he will find spores of the pathogen Phytophthora infestans that causes this disease during the season. But oftentimes we can't find any late blight to go along with those detections of spores. So we encourage you as you go out and scout, make sure you're watching areas especially that stay wet longer to see if you have these lesions that have a light green margin or halo around the edge. Early in the morning on the underside of the leaves you might see this white sporulation. Those are the spores that are being produced. And the reason late blight is so horrible, or why it spreads so fast, is you can get over 100,000 spores produced in 1 square centimeter on this tissue. And so as the humidity changes, those spores will get up into the air and they'll move around. They don't really do that well under semi-arid conditions when it's dry. But, and so even when we talk about pivot irrigation, how we're keeping the fields wet so long, that still isn't enough to really have this disease spread really fast. When we have thunderstorms that come through, that's when the pathogen can spread and the disease can take off like wildfire. So it's important to watch. Once the spore lands on the leaf, if the temperature is cool enough, meaning probably around 60 degrees, each spore can actually release 8 to 10 little swimming spores. So if you think of it like here's a bomb that comes and lands on the leaf and then it sends out 10 more. And so you get these little spots, these little infections scattered all over the leaf right here. So that's potato late blight. Seed is very important. In fact, I'm quite convinced that most of the time, the majority of the time in Idaho, when it does show up, is from infected seed. So the good news is we haven't had a lot of late blight out around, especially in areas where we buy seed from. So it's likely that we're not going to be bringing it in. And also a good protective fungicide program will help. And Trent's going to talk about that later, things to keep in mind. Stem lesions. There are many things that actually cause the stem to look like that, but that's one thing about late blight. These stem lesions can actually survive long periods of very hot weather. And then here you have a broken petiole. The stem lesions of late blight are actually more destructive than those of, say, early blight or some others that can look very similar to it. So here's the next one. This is a Ranger russet plant that looks kind of crinkly here. In fact, some areas I've got this white appearance. Is this herbicide damage, potato virus Y, early blight, or potato leaf roll virus? What do you think? This happens to be potato virus Y. Last year we had Jonathan Whitworth come and he has put together this publication where they looked at different strains of the potato virus and also tested those on different varieties. And you see that different strains of the virus can cause different symptoms and they can be manifest differently in different varieties. So This right here is Ranger russet that's infected with PBY NO strain. Here you have infected versus a healthy, and the Rangers respond pretty bad. This beats them up pretty hard. PBY and Wilga on a Yukon Gold, you actually get these external lesions on the tube that look like somewhat circular in nature. And here's PBY NTN on Alturas. And I apologize for the picture being a little bit dark, but there's these little round rings or arcs that are on the inside of the tuber. So the symptoms can be wide-ranging, and really the key to managing PBY is to buy as clean seed as you can get. We talk about how the insects, especially the aphids, can transmit the PBY, and so there's been work looking at insecticides to try to manage that. But the problem is, for the insecticide to work, of course, the aphid has to land, it has to probe on the plant and absorb enough of that insecticide to kill it. And by the time it's done that, it's already transmitted the virus if it was carrying it. And so the insecticides themselves don't really work that good. There is some work that's being done on oils, mineral oils that can be sprayed on the plant, and that actually will prevent the aphids from feeding, or at least prevents the transmission. But even there, that is not going to be a silver bullet and solve all the problems there. The next question, which disease is this? You have this bumpy tuber right here. You peel it, you see these nice little dots. Is this the root knot nematode? Is it powdery scab, common scab, or is this a symptom of the potato mop top virus? Give you just a second to think about that. And the answer here is, this is the root knot nematode. If you could take one of those little spots, jump back here, and cut this out and put it under a microscope, you would see an egg with a little nematode in it. Of course, they will hatch out of that, and they'll swim around in the soil, and they'll try to find potatoes to feed on. And so when they do that, they infect the tubers, they lay eggs, and then you see these spots right here. We used to joke and say, we ought to label this as your meat and potatoes at the same time, right? Protein enhanced, is you're getting the nematode with it. But this is a very tough one to manage. Really, the main way we rely on this is with nematicides and fumigants. When we get to the soil health presentation, we'll talk about that, because this is the biggest pressure, or one of the biggest pressures we have coming down, is to get rid of a lot of these products. And as that happens, it may make this more of a common problem that we see. So here's another picture. We have these potato with these growths on them. Is this Roundup drift, potato wart,
on it,
powdery scab, or potato mop top virus? You can probably guess. You'll notice that I've borrowed these images. They're not images that I have. Unfortunately, hopefully they're not images that any of you would ever have, because this one is potato wart. And I brought this up because this has recently been found in Prince Edward Island. In fact, this is a press release that came from the Canadian government, and they're talking about wart. It's a Syncytium endobioticum. And in October 2021, they confirmed the presence of the wart in 2 fields on PEI. And this is a huge deal. It initiated a mandatory quarantine. So the potatoes from PEI could not come in the United States. And this has been quite a contentious issue, because the Canadians are saying, well, we're doing everything we can to fix and solve this problem. There's some in the US who are saying, well, you're not doing enough. The short of it is, regardless of which side you want to believe, this is a disease that once it gets in the soil will last for a very long time, and we don't want to have it. So you can imagine it's somewhat similar to the experience that we had when the pale cyst nematode was found in Idaho. You know, all kinds of borders all of a sudden slammed shut, and that area became quarantined, and there's been, since that time, so much work to try to get rid of it. And so we don't want this coming in. So this year, hopefully you never see anything like this, but if you do, please make sure you get it tested to see, indeed, is it wart or is it something else? And sometimes you can have growth of the sprouts that will almost look like a little cauliflower from, say, Roundup damage, and it can look kind of similar, but not exactly. So what disease do we have here on these potato roots? Is this rhizoc, blackleg, black dot, or is it powdery scab? And this is actually a trick question because here we've got rhizoc on this lesion and black dot on this one. So have you ever seen this difference out in the field? I think we go pull up stems, and whenever we see this discoloration, I think it's normal to say, well, this must be rhizoc, because that's very common. And you get this striated symptom where the stem kind of cracks open. But with rhizoctonia, most of the time, maybe all the time, it's going to be somewhat of a dry decay, and you don't get cell tissue that flakes off. Whereas with black dot, the outer infected tissue here will actually kind of flake away from the stem. And it does look a little bit different. A lot of times people see black dot occurring closer to the soil line, and so look at lesions that may start here and go down. But in this case, it was different. In fact, we have a little rhizoc lesion here and the black dot lesion lower. But when it comes to managing these things, rotation is important. Rhizoctonia lives in the soil. And the longer your rotation, if you're up, say, if you can get to a 5-year rotation, the soil may not be providing much rhizoc to you at all. But if you're on a 3-year rotation, it's a good chance you have some in the soil. We have a lot of fungicides that we can use. Some are seed treatments, some are in-furrow sprays, and they're very effective at managing rhizoc. But when it comes to black dot, this is very much more difficult. So there's no doubt that the black dot makes the stem look bad. In certain circumstances, it can make the tubers look bad. And black dot can also cause the plants to, it looks like it's causing them to die. And there are foliar fungicides that will limit the symptoms on the above ground portion of the plant. But we have not been able to show that those fungicide programs will control what happens below ground, what you're seeing on the stems or what you see in the tubers. And so it's not clear that, I guess the best way to say it, spending money to control black dot pays for itself. In fact, I would contend that it does not. It's better to manage for other foliar diseases, and if you happen to get black dot control from that, that's great. But I would not go out and say, I am going to spend money primarily to target black dot. Because all the research we have available shows is that it doesn't result in an increase in yield and grade in the end. So here's another symptom of black dot. I mentioned this, it's closer to the top of the soil line, growing down this way. And it does have a different appearance than rhizoc. Here's a good shot of rhizoctonia canker. Again, it's a little bit lighter in color. And with rhizoc, you tend to get the stolons nipped off. And what will happen is you'll have usually a lower tuber count, and those tubers tend to become misshapen or they get created out as coals later on. So it really hurts you in a number of different ways with rhizoc. You maybe have seen this white growth at the base of the stem. This is actually the sexual stage of rhizoctonia. This doesn't really seem to be related to the severity of rhizoctonia below ground. Sometimes we've seen this with very, very light lesions below. This doesn't really seem to hurt the plant. In fact, you can take it with your finger, your thumb, and you can just scrape this right off. But sometimes people have said, well, is this white mold? Is white mold starting? The answer is no, it's not. This is rhizoctonia. So what's this disease right here? You're out scouting, you've got this, you have your dead plant tissue on the bottom here. We have a couple of potato buds that have fallen on the ground, and then you see this little mushroom right here. Is this white mold, gray mold, black dot, or is this really not a disease? And the correct answer is this is not a disease. This is the bird's nest fungus. And there are several different species. You ask yourself, well, what do I need to do to manage this? You don't. This is a good sign. This means you have some level of decaying organic matter out in your field, and that we tend to associate that with being a good thing for the potato plants. So in contrast, this is what they call the apothecia. It's like just think of it like a little mushroom that's produced by the white mold pathogen. And they do look very different. These have these little, you can see what I call it the bird's nest fungus. Looks like little bird eggs down the nest. And comparing this little mushroom here, This is a little bit hard to see, but there's several of these scattered right through here. They're quite small. They can be very easy to miss. These little black dots there and up here, these are the sclerotia of the white mold fungus. So now I've shifted gears back to white mold, and we'll crack open the stem, and you can see these formed inside the stem. And when the stem dies, they drop on the soil. This is one of those sclerotia. We zoomed in really close to see what it would look like. Then here you have this little tiny mushroom or apothecium growing off of it. So these are very, very small. One thing I will say is that as we've done all of our fungicide trials, it is common for us to see these apothecia down in the soil at times, even after we sprayed a fungicide. So sometimes we'll have people call and say, well, I've sprayed a fungicide, it's supposed to be good. I went out and I saw this. I guess what I'd say is I'm not convinced that the fungicide applications will prevent these sclerotia from forming apothecia. But what the fungicides do is they protect the plant from any of the spores that are released from this from causing an infection. And so if you go out and see these, it's not necessarily a sign that your application didn't work, but it's rather, you know that you have sclerotia out there in the field. So where's the disease we have on this stem right here? It's this white mold, gray mold, black dot, or aerial stem rot. And in this case, we have white mold right here. That's that white growth. In fact, this is a sclerotia that's forming on the outside of the stem. And we also have gray mold right here. And many of the foliar fungicides that we spray are active against gray mold. There's a lot. We do have some that are good on white mold, which we'll talk about later. That really is the best way to control these. And I think we've seen more and more of these lately. Some people use the term jungle rot, as we have these dense canopies, and it gets really hot outside, or the temperatures get high. These lower stems start to decay, and you can get bacterial soft rot or aerial vine rot. You may get black dot. You get a lot of different things that make these stems look bad. This is another example of gray mold, and if you've seen this, if you pull up the canopy and you see like a little puff of what looks like smoke almost, that is the gray mold fungus releasing all the spores. It can infect the leaves. This is an example of one. It looks a little bit different than late blight, but gray mold has actually been mistaken for late blight in the past. So it's important to get a good diagnosis. So now, if any of you are interested, there is a resource online that is put by the Ontario Potato Board called the Potato Field Guide. It's a guide to insect diseases and defects. And they used to have a hard copy. If any of you have been by my office before and brought a sample, you've probably seen me pull this out. They stopped printing it, but they did make it freely available online. So you can go and search for this, the Ontario Potato Field Guide, or if you want to scan it, this QR code, it will bring it up. It is probably the best guide that I have ever found for trying to determine if you have an unknown symptom, what it may be. The PDF book, is just loaded with photographs, and it covers just about everything you could think of, and even probably many things that you haven't even thought of. So it's a very good book. If you're interested, you can stop by my office and I can show that to you also. So take-home message from all of this is that it really is important to make sure you have a proper diagnosis of diseases when you see something wrong in the field. I could give you a number of cases where a quick judgment was made about a certain disease. And as a result of that, a recommendation was made to spray a pesticide that was wrong. And so the grower made a mistake, or at least used the wrong product and went to the wrong treatment. And there's a lot of resources out there that you can use that don't cost. University of Idaho Extension and several of their offices are able to identify. I mentioned James Woodall. He runs the diagnostic lab at Parma, and he has a lot of tools. He's a lot better at identifying things that are very difficult than, say, that I can do. And so there are certain diseases that we really require a molecular diagnosis, and James is very good at doing that. You can bring stuff to us at Miller Research, and we may know the answer. If not, we usually end up sending it to James or someone else. or you can go to a number of different places.